when that character referred to the infected as a zombie, I know some of you felt like you had the rage virus yourself. Stings, doesn't it? What is up, guys? Welcome to my review of 28 Years Later, my most anticipated film of 2025. I am a huge fan of 28 Days Later, as well as 28 Weeks Later. I have been waiting with bated breath, like a lot of you guys, for what seems like it's been 28 years for another film to come out in this franchise. And when we finally got the official announcement that not only are we getting it, but it is the kickoff to a brand new trilogy, and the creative team that made the first film, director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland, were returning to make it, you could not have aligned the stars of awesome better. Now, I'm going to do my best to give as much of a spoiler-free review as possible, but this film isn't necessarily the type of film where I feel like you have to be extremely vague, like there's huge shocks, reveals, surprises, anything like that. Certain things, I will certainly be as non-descriptive as possible. Others, I need to get into a little bit of the details just to be able to have a coherent thought. And the basic premise of this film is that you have a young boy who is escorting his dying mother into the quarantine zone of the UK to find a mysterious doctor. Starting off with the positives for 28 Years Later, the thing that I enjoyed the most about this film is that I really liked getting back into this world and seeing how things have progressed or regressed since the outbreak in the first two films, seeing how society has collapsed or what things have changed 28 years later in this post-apocalyptic world. And the route that they took here I thought was interesting, where you definitely go back to more of a primitive version of humanity, of society, where the humans that are left alive is very much like medieval times. Everything is about, clubs and spikes and arrows and very much just leaving people to their devices. If you go outside into the quarantine zone, you're leaving at your own risk. We are not sending rescue parties after you. Even the way that the main character, this young boy of the film, has to go out on like this rite of passage. And that's kind of the main character arc that he is going through in this film, is rising to the occasion of basically becoming a man in this world where you have to grow up very quickly. And even the way that the infected have kind of gone primitive in a certain way, where they're very much almost caveman-like, which I'll get into a little bit more specificity later. It was interesting to see the directions that they chose. When you got to 28 Days Later, and then you went to 28 Weeks, you got a lot more into society being in the big cities and how technology was going to be used to try to contain this virus. And now we have just completely gone away from that, where society has collapsed to the point where technology is almost like a myth. It's almost like this tales of the old time. And anytime you do that, anytime you take characters into the future, but it's an alternate future that is very much like what we know as the past, I think there's a lot of inherent interesting things that you can do there, both visually, with the characters, and with the world building. It also allows you to get to very human emotions, very human themes, because you're stripping away a lot of the distractions of the modern world. You're getting rid of technology and transportation and politics in a lot of ways, and you're going back to just very base level emotions, base level wants and needs, where just a simple piece of bacon is like a commodity to these people. And so the value of life and the way that they mourn death is very different in this type of society than it would be in our modern world. And even just that central theme there, which is really rampant throughout this third film, the way that people deal with death and the acceptance and the mourning of death, it's an interesting thing to explore here. We talked about the first film in my review, where it was very much about the collapse of society and losing all hope for humanity, and then regaining that hope as you find love, as you find, father, mentorship, things like that. And 28 Weeks Later kind of expanded on that a bit. And this one certainly carries that torch, where it is a thematic through line through these three films, but this one's much more reflective. It's much more looking at everything that we have lost and kind of paying respects to that while we carve a path for this new trilogy. Acting across the board is very good. You have Aaron Taylor Johnson in here as the father to our main character, and he's somebody it's been interesting to watch him mature as an actor, where you grew up watching him in things like Kick-Ass, and now he's playing father characters. He's a lot better in this than he was in Craven, I can give you that much. Jodie Comer, probably the standout of this movie. Just recently saw her in The Bike Riders, and I think that she really has a lot on her shoulders here as a woman who is suffering from some sort of illness and is essentially losing her mind a little bit, very similar to The Infected, but, obviously in a more human way, if that makes any sense. Alfie Williams playing Spike, who is your protagonist here. Kid actors, very much a roll of the dice. Sometimes they can destroy a movie with their talent level. I think that this kid is very good, and I'm very interested to see him, what I would assume is being the one who carries the next two films and is the central figure of this trilogy. And then, of course, you have Ralph Fiennes in here, who is an actor that we all know is incredible, one of the best working, and his character's not in the movie a lot. He's very much saved for the third act of the film, but you feel a lot of buildup to his character's reveal. Even just seeing him for like a quick second in the trailer, I knew there was going to be something very interesting going on with whatever his character is doing, and he's another person that I'm really interested to see get developed out even more throughout this trilogy. Now, dealing with the characters themselves, there's some interesting things going on that certainly had my attention throughout. There's some pretty cliche storylines going on as far as exploration, as far as, escorting somebody to try to find some form of a cure or some form of help. That's kind of become almost a crutch of this subgenre to a certain degree. But there were elements here mainly dealing with the relationship between Aaron Taylor Johnson and Alfie Williams' character that I thought was intriguing, that I'm curious to see where that ultimately goes, where very much dealing with how myths and legends and stories can evolve, especially in these primitive times where that's all you have. You don't have the internet, you don't have fiction in the form of written novels or movies or anything like that. It's just tales that you hear everybody say. And so elements where, you have this rite of passage where Aaron Taylor Johnson has taken his son out for his first hunt and, basically trying to get him to become a man. And things don't exactly go perfectly well. And seeing how Aaron Taylor Johnson is kind of building up this myth of how awesome his son is and how much of a badass that he is, and his son very much pushing back against that and wanting more the truth versus the legend, as well as some of the stories out there about Ralph Fiennes' character, this, mythological doctor, like this guy who might have lost his mind and might be this very evil, very psychotic person out there, but who knows, maybe. I thought there was an interesting thing there of showing how stories can both be exaggerated versions of the truth as well as exaggerated versions of a lie, and trying to get to the meat of where the actual truth lies. That there was something about that specific theme, that specific element of the story that they were telling that I thought was really intriguing. In the second act of the film, there's this character, Eric, that comes in who has survived in an area of the world that has not been devastated by the virus to this degree. And his interactions with our main characters, I thought was very entertaining because there's this dark, cheeky humor to him having modern time knowledge that they very much have grown up without. And so things like cell phones and certain elements of technology, or even just culture, like how people wear makeup and things like that, led to some very funny dialogue interactions. So for a movie and a series, really a trilogy that has always leaned much more on the dark, depressing side of things, I thought that the few moments of humor there was a really nice little change of pace. The gore and the carnage, very satisfied with that. I'm glad that we go back to practical. There's no CGI bullshit. At least most of it did not look CGI. It leaned very much onto practical stuff. And I'm not going to say specifically what happens, but let's just say the infected found new ways to fuck people up, and oh, I am so here for it. It was a very cool reference to one of my favorite films of the 80s. So yes, if you're a carnotaur like me, get ready. They deliver. As far as the filmmaking, I think that this is a very well made film. I think it's shot very well. That we've seen a lot of these pictures get shared around on social media of these little iPhone rigs that they have built specifically for this film's production. The whole thing was shot on iPhone, I believe using the Blackmagic app. And what I really like about that can very easily be kind of a seemingly strange choice for a filmmaker to take, but what I liked about the end result is that Danny Boyle is able to somewhat recreate that gritty, raw, indie style look of the original film without having it be so low res and ugly looking. Like, that is a very controversial creative choice that he made in the first film, to shoot it on digital cameras that at the time were not very advanced technologically. So it has that very low res look to it. And, people have been debating that for almost 20 years now about whether or not that is a part of the DNA of what makes that film work, or it's a stylistic choice that has not aged very well at all. And I always find myself kind of in the middle on that one. But I think he did a good job at recreating what he was going for in that original film while not being held back with the technological limitations of digital cameras at the time. So shot very well. The set design, production design, costume design, and all of that is pretty incredible here. I love the look of this primitive society. I love the look of both the human characters as well as the infected and how they have kind of evolved and gone a little bit more primitive themselves. I love the look of like the Bone Temple, which is very present on all of the movie's posters. It was a very good looking film, a very cool visual take on this form of post-apocalyptic world. For the most part, everything that Danny Boyle brought, say that 15 times fast. Pretty much everything that Danny Boyle brought as a director, I really appreciated here. Moving on to the mixed. As I have kind of hinted at a couple of times, they do advance or evolve the infected in this film. You know, it's been 28 years later. The first two films were pretty close in succession as far as the timeline there. And so we didn't really get to see what this virus does to people after a long period of time. And so you would expect them to go in the direction of showing some kind of advanced form of infected, or maybe even a regressed form of infected. And they kind of do both here. I'm not going to say specifically how they do it because I would consider that spoilers. But what I will say is that some of the decisions that they made as far as showing this new version of the infected, I thought was really interesting. I thought that it was cool. It led to some really nice moments of carnage, as I've already talked about. While there are some others that I think really loses the grounded nature of the first two films. I think the 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later movies do some of the best jobs in this subgenre of having a very grounded, dare I say, realistic take on an infection apocalypse. We knew very quickly how the rage virus worked, how it was transmitted, what happens to people whenever they get infected with it, how it's able to spread. And so there was never a whole lot of questioning going on with the lore of those first two films and how it all works. This film takes some pretty massive leaps that do nothing but ask massive questions that I don't know if we're going to have answered or not, which is why I have it in the mixed here, because very easily in the second film, or maybe even the third film in this trilogy, we could get some sort of context to how the infected are able to do what they're doing in this movie and how everything works, or at least their primitive theories on how it's able to work, and hopefully there'll be satisfying answers. Or they might not bother at all and just say, hey, this is the world, fucking accept it or don't. And when it's a little difficult to do that sometimes with some of the leaps that they make here, where you really start to ask some very logical questions about, okay, knowing what I know about the rage virus, how does that make sense? So time will tell with that one. I think I lean positive as far as, you know, the visuals and the carnage that comes from this version of the infected, but the thinking part of me, it was certainly frustrated by the end of this film at wanting to understand it more. And the other thing that I'm going to put here in the mixed is honestly one of the most important things that I want to hammer home in this review. This is a film that ultimately I was disappointed by. There's a lot of things in it that I think are well done. There's a lot of things in it that I think are going to be even better for others than it was for me. I think that, like I said, the filmmaking is great. A lot of the things going on behind the camera as well as in front of the camera with the performances, I think, are top notch. And I'm glad to be back in this world, and I'm invested. I want to see the second film. I will be there day one. But there's a lot of decisions in this movie that frustrated me, and even more so some decisions that left me completely baffled, just racking my brain going, why is that here? What does that add? And what exactly are you going for? Because this just feels so out of left field. Now, what I will say about that is that when you have a film like this that has a very divisive nature to it, this is destined to be, if not one of, the most divisive horror film of the year. I know everybody's watching it today. I guarantee you by Sunday, it's going to be opinions all over the place, all over the map on this one. And there's a certain amount of intrigue and value in that. Of course, we all love walking into a film that has that 4-quadrant blockbuster appeal where most people that walk out of it go, man, that was a good time. And you have this communal experience where everybody goes in and they enjoyed themselves. And you walk out and everybody says, yeah, I enjoyed that. I spent my money well. That was cool. There's a level of satisfaction with that. There's a very different level of satisfaction when you have a film that has a very mixed response, and some people are loving it, some people are hating it. There's a lot of people in the middle, and you get to walk out, if you do in fact end up on the lucky side that enjoys it, you get to walk out with this other level of satisfaction of, oh man, I weathered the storm, I walked into this divisive film, and luckily, because I hate being disappointed, I walked out actually really enjoying it. Sometimes those movies, those experiences, I value even more than the mass appeal ones. Unfortunately, this time, I just didn't end up on that side, which happens. This is a movie that I think there's so many things about it that confuse me and frustrate me that my expectations absolutely were not met, despite some things I'd really enjoyed. And you have to let that be okay. I only dropped a little out of theater reaction on Twitter that gave no specificity whatsoever to what disappointed me, what frustrated me, what confused me. Basically, all I said was this was my most anticipated of the year. Now it's probably going to be one of my most disappointing of the year. While it was well made, a lot of things baffled me. And the level of toxic negative responses that I got with no context whatsoever on where I was coming from, while it certainly didn't surprise me because I've been doing this long enough to just expect that's going to happen. A couple of times a year, there's a movie that's going to happen. It still disappoints me. It still disappoints me that there's so many people out there that live in this brain-rotted mentality of everything has to be a masterpiece or a piece of garbage, that they can't fucking comprehend any opinion in the middle. Anything that has nuance or any kind of a mixed attitude to the way things feel or a complicated nature to it, their brains fucking short circuit, and their only response is just rage, condescension, and insults. And it's seriously destroying movie discourse. Like, I walked out of the theater still overall positive on this film, but just being disappointed by it because I expected it to be one of my favorites of the year, and it's not even close. Just in an hour of discourse with others that most of which probably haven't even seen the fucking movie yet, my emotions and my attitude are already pushed so much further negative than they were, which is the most baffling part of all, because I know at the root of all of that ignorance, the main motivating factor for people that treat others that way when they have a differing opinion is, man, I really wish you had the same experience as me. I wish you loved this the same way that I did, or at least the same way I expect to when I actually see it. But very rarely does coming at somebody and attacking them and insulting them and, you know, making their opinion less than important or less than your own, that almost never wins people over. In fact, almost always it's going to push them even further away from where you want them to be. It's going to push them even further into disliking the film specifically because of the fans and the discourse that surrounds it is so toxic and miserable that they want nothing to do with it. I could go on for another hour on this subject, but all I need to say is just fucking be better. Fucking be better. Be a little bit more mature. Be a little bit more secure in your own opinion that you don't need it to be validated by strangers on the internet. I don't give a fuck if I'm the only person on planet Earth that is disappointed by 28 years later. That's my honest opinion. That is my honest experience, and that is why I do what I do. Not to say what you want me to say, not to say what the studios want me to say, not to say what's going to get me more access to fucking screeners or film festivals or anything else. It's telling you 100% how I feel after I experience a piece of art. And if that's not what we're doing, why the fuck are we here? Now, with all that out of the way, moving on to the negatives of 28 years later. When you really boil this story down to its basic plot, I felt it was very straightforward, very simple, and unfortunately, very derivative. 28 days later was such a shot in the arm to the zombie subgenre. That's right, I said zombies. Deal with it. The zombie subgenre. That so many things that came after it were highly inspired by 28 Days Later. Dawn of the Dead, the Zack Snyder version, certainly elements of The Walking Dead, of course. The Last of Us is a huge thing that was inspired by 28 Days Later. And now, because there's been such a large gap in time since those movies came out and made the impact that they did, there's been so many other versions of zombie media, both in film and television, that this very simple, basic story of coming of age, exploration, escorting somebody who is sick, it feels very derivative of all the things that were inspired by 28 Days Later. There's a lot of this movie that feels a lot like Last of Us. It feels a lot like The Road. And so I felt myself throughout the film almost feeling bored because all the directions it was going didn't really have much intrigue or surprise or investment in me beyond just the characters that I thought were interesting. I already knew the writing was on the wall with certain storylines, where they were going to end up by the third act. And so the storyline in this film I felt was very disappointing. You know, it's something that there's still elements there that have some meat on them with the themes and with the character arcs and things that I enjoyed. But the overall story, I wish that there was something more there. And maybe we'll get that in the second and third film. Maybe this was just the necessary kind of slow start to all of that. And all of the most interesting ideas are going to be in Nia DaCosta's film that comes out next year. I hope that's the case. But for this film to stand on its own, it needs its own interesting story. And I didn't quite feel like we got that. There were a number of points in the film where I highly questioned the decisions of the characters. Some of them felt out of character and some of them just felt downright stupid. There was, without saying too much, there's an element of this film that Aaron Taylor Johnson is very absent from that never made sense for his absence. I never bought him not being present for that part of the story. There's also a number of other things that are just kind of classic dumb character decisions in horror films, which you can get away with a few of those, but there's a few in here that are so ridiculously dumb that I don't like when a film that's aiming for the heights that something like this is to resort to that. You know, we expect a little bit of that with horror when we're just trying to get characters from point A to point B, and they kind of have to do some dumb shit to cause some conflict to keep the movie going. When you lean a little bit too much into that, it gets a little bit annoying and frustrating. Kind of along those lines, there's an element that gets introduced into the back half of this film that involves an infant. And I really don't like when post-apocalyptic movies, namely zombie movies or TV shows, bring an infant into the fold, because they almost always have to have a unbelievably unrealistic portrayal of how an infant behaves to make that work. Like, A Quiet Place is the only movie that I think halfway makes it work, and they have to stick to a lot of bullshit to even sell you on that. When you live in a world where even the slightest sound can mean the demise of you and everybody around you, an infant means you're all fucking doomed. There's no baby on planet Earth in history that is going to allow people to survive in a zombie apocalypse. So I don't know. We'll see what happens with that. But when you introduce a baby, I'm calling bullshit on almost every sequence that follows. Because this is the first film in a planned trilogy, it certainly does have a little bit of part one-itis, where a lot of things in this feel like setup. A lot of this feels like we're building towards all the more interesting stuff later on, which I've already kind of addressed. And that does leave the film feeling slightly unsatisfying as an isolated story. When you plan a trilogy, I feel like it's very important to make each individual chapter of that trilogy stand on its own as a whole story, with a beginning, middle, and end, with a thematic through line, with a character arc that's satisfied by the end. And there's certain aspects of that I think they satisfy by this one, mainly with the main character's coming-of-age character arc. But there's so many other things that just feel like we're introducing all this stuff. We're not giving answers for any of it. We're not even really going to give you any kind of an indication on where we're going with things. We're just leaving them dangling. And we'll see you in January where you get all these answers, maybe. There's an inherent frustration with that. I'm glad the movie's already shot. I'm glad we only have to wait 6-7 months to see it versus waiting to see if this is a financial success and maybe we'll get our answers in 2029. So I'm not as frustrated with it, but there is a frustration there. It's like watching the first episode of a season of television and the next episode's not for 7 months. And now moving on to what was probably my biggest issue with the film, and that is some very distinct stylistic choices that Danny Boyle and possibly even Alex Garland made that were very distracting to me. You know, there's a bit of an art house flair to 28 Days Later. You know, there's certain scenes, certain editing choices, even, the way that they shot on a digital camera that definitely was against the grain a bit. You know, you could think of even just that one scene where in the middle act of the film where the car is driving and you have the field with the flowers that's made to look like an oil painting that stylistically, visually within the film can feel very out of place and jarring. But I can find a purpose for that. If I think about the theme of the movie, the theme of that middle act of the film especially, I can justify why that shot, why that stylistic choice was there. Most of the stylistic choices that they made in 28 Years Later, Granted, I've only seen it a couple hours ago. I'm really struggling to figure out what the purpose was. I'm struggling to figure out what it added to the film. It felt very jarring to me, not only tonally, but just visually. There was a number of things that they were doing that felt very redundant and odd, like splicing in B-roll from this medieval times film. I think it was like Henry V or something like that, that I don't understand what that was supposed to convey. If it's something dealing with lore that I'm missing, sure, I guess I'll own that, but it just felt very jarring to me. If it's something as basic of, we're going to splice in medieval times imagery with the society that's very much been reverted back to medieval times, that feels very simple and pretentious. So there was a number of things in the first act like that with the editing choices, even some of the editing choices with some of the chasing and the zombie fighting with bows and arrows with a lot of like punk rock freeze frames and things that, I don't know, that felt like they worked better in 28 Days Later than they did in the context of this film. And even just the tonal whiplash that you have in the 3 acts of this movie, where they feel so distinctly different that it feels like it lacks cohesion. You know, the first act of the film, the direction it feels like it's going on, the style of the movie, very different than what you're going on with the second half or the second act of it, which is very different than the third act. And maybe the most of all, the actual ending of this film, the note that it leaves you on, one of the biggest what the fuck moments that I can remember in recent memory. Like, you have the film that you're on that already has a bit of tonal whiplash, but whatever, you get used to it. You get to the last 5 minutes of this movie, and it literally feels like something completely out of nowhere. It feels like a totally different movie, totally different world. I mean, you're in like primitive medieval times, zombie apocalypse movie, and then suddenly you're met with a group of characters that I can only describe as what would happen if the Backstreet Boys fucked the Power Rangers. I don't understand it. And it's one of those things that inherently is going to be divisive. There's going to be people that look at some of the bold, unique choices that they go with in this film and say, I love the fact that it's so different. I love the fact that it has the balls to just do the wackiest fucking thing out of nowhere and give no fucks if anybody likes it or understands it. And unfortunately, I'm going to lean more on that side of the camp. I was puzzled and baffled at a number of things in this film. Now, one element of that I do want to address, I had somebody point out to me on Twitter that there's a number of things at play with this movie that deals very directly with British history, British culture, British folklore that is just missed on me because I'm an American. I really wish this person would have told me that in a way that was less antagonistic and less insulting, but the heart of what they're saying there, that's possible. It's possible that there's things going on here that you cannot truly appreciate or understand the context of unless you're British. Fine. Maybe. When my buddy Brian Lomax sees it, I guess I'll get that confirmed or denied. But I don't think that possibly being true negates the fact that you have then made your film so niche that you've alienated a section of your audience. Like, if you want to make the isolation of this quarantine society be some kind of an allegory for Brexit, or if you want to throw some British folklore into the editing or the visual style of the film, if you want to have this fucking out of nowhere Power Rangers type reference to Jimmy Savile, that's your prerogative as a filmmaker. But anybody that doesn't pick up on those references, they are totally left in the dark and probably are not going to understand or enjoy elements of your film. All in all, guys, is 28 Years Later something you should go out and see? If you're a fan of this franchise and you've been waiting as long as I have, go and check it out, because it's inherently divisive, but you might end up on the winning side of that. You might like it way more than I did, or you might end up in the middle like me, where you don't necessarily regret seeing it. There's some cool things about it, but some frustrations there. And if you end up hating it, that's an interesting part of the discourse as well. So check it out. Give it your own opinion. For me, it didn't meet my expectations, but I'm hoping that the rest of this trilogy will hopefully be more of what I want, what I expect, what I hope for from a continuation of this franchise. But only time will tell. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2025 new release reviews. I'm also going to point you to a playlist up here where currently my 28 Days Later review, and in a couple of days, my 28 Weeks Later review will be in there as well. But review of this whole trilogy, I might rank them here in a couple of days. Just depends on how much time that I have. But regardless, I will certainly rank them once we get the rest of this trilogy. Like, share, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss all of that in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.